Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. And Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Well, good. Today, I would like to talk about the contest between protectionism and free trade. It's been going on for a long time, literally thousands of years for that matter. But certainly in this campaign that's going on, our presidential campaign, they don't deal with issues in a serious manner, matter of fact. But the issue of protectionism has come up, and it's leaking out, it is out there, but not in a philosophic manner. It's usually a demagoguing each other, and if we have protectionism, I'm going to bring all these jobs back and all. But I would like to talk about what free trade really means. You and I have both made the point that some of the strongest protectionists, the people who want to interfere with free trade, accuse us of being isolationists. And yet, for instance, what's going on with Iran, I hope you mentioned that a little bit later on. But, Bastiat was the one that used the term. I understand that he might not have coined it originally, but that is, if goods don't cross borders, armies will. And I think that principle is true. Not instantaneously, you don't put up one tariff and the next day there's an army come in. But this whole idea of the breakdown of an economy where protectionism is going on, and as if you can put on some item and say, all right, we're going to tax your goods because it's unfair, and nothing will happen. No downside, no unintended consequences. So, but I might start off with ask you, because in the news was this tariff, that we want to put on. I don't know whether it's in effect or not, but we immediately have an agreement where things are better with Iran. But, the neocons, those great free traders and peaceful people, they immediately, have another battle to fight. How legitimate is their argument? Well, they deserve it. They're trying to build weapons, and they really didn't give in, and they can still build a nuclear weapon. But what's the significance about that?
Well, these are new trade sanctions, or new sanctions on companies that the U.S. says helped Iran develop a ballistic missile. Iran says, well, a ballistic missile can deliver a conventional warhead. We've already signed the agreement that we're not building a nuclear weapon nor planning to, and that has been confirmed by the UN. So we're not even allowed to have ballistic missiles to protect ourselves, and when every country around them has one. But I think the larger picture here is, as you pointed out, I think the neocons and others who don't want peace with Iran are terrified of the fact that Iran is now going to join the world community. As you pointed out in your column this week, they're going to buy 100 airplanes. They want to sell their oil. There are so many things they've been restricted from buying. I have some Persian American friends who are posting pictures of Iranian caviar on their Facebook saying, I can't wait to get my hands on this again. So everyone is happy about trade, and it destroys the neocons' desire that we've got to smash Iran in the region and take over the Middle East.
Not only the neocons terrified about having peace breaking out, they're terrified that free trade will break out, that trade may be facilitated. So they are, always cutting in and finding something that they have to find wrong, especially if it has to do with Iran. But that is a trade issue. But the presidential campaign has introduced these ideas because there has been one of the candidates, he happens to be leading the pack on the Republican side, that he has made some suggestions. He said that at one time, well, Chinese, they're at fault. It's not our Fed, it's not our taxes, it's not our regulations that put us at a handicap. It's always the Chinese fault. And that's where I think Trump is wrong. He ought to look more domestically in our Federal Reserve. So he says, well, they're selling too much stuff. Well, maybe the American consumer like it. Maybe the price is right. But he decides that at one time he said 45% tariff on anything coming in from China. He does this with a straight face. What really gets me is the interviewers at the debates. They never, what are you talking about? But now I guess he got the message that maybe 45 is too high. So he said, let's just put on 35% tariff. But this is hardly going to be helpful to our consumer.
Maybe you can explain what that would do. I mean, because the problem with protectionism is for those not well versed in in economic theory, it sounds seductive. They say it'll bring jobs, it'll make people have better salaries and better incomes, and we'll be able to build stuff here. And there's a seductive quality to the idea of protectionism.
Yeah, and it's so easy for those who like it. They say, well, yeah, free trade is okay as long as it's fair. And that gives them an excuse that fair, just like fairness by liberals in the domestic economy, is always socialism and welfare redistribution. So fair means you have to regulate entirely on how people are allowed to spend their money. And one challenge on this is challenge the morality of who owns ourselves. Well, you know, we own our own selves, and that's why we have civil liberties, but we should own the fruits of our labor and get to spend them the way we want. But this immediately said, well, it's your money, but we have to take this much because taxes to make you safe and secure. And also, we want to make sure that you don't get a good price from somebody from goods overseas. And they see at the short end, they say, all these jobs were taken from us. Well, how do they know that? You know, maybe, let's say we couldn't build cars anymore, which we had a period of time we weren't building as many. But cars are built overseas and they subsidize we buy in the car. But still there's a lot of jobs, you know, selling cars. So they can't say that it takes jobs away. But on the surface, it looks that way and people are prone to it. Our job market is horrible. But is it because our consumers are getting by a little bit better because they can buy cheap goods and from overseas? But what they don't look at is the fact that the little guy suffers the most from this. The prices go up, and then they don't realize that a tariff is a tax. And the Chinese, they don't pay the tax. If they're going to sell it to us, they'll pay it, but it goes into the price. And that's what the protectionists want. And so, but if they still want these goods, it's a tax on the people. And this is, you know, just another way for the government to tax the people, whether it's inflation or not. The other thing that they're doing is trying to correct the mistakes of the Federal Reserve, because easy money, low interest rates, a lot of this so-called capital, we export it by buying goods and services. It sounds great, and then, but it serves, there is a balance, because as we do this, the Chinese and others actually penalize their economy on the long run because they monetize it. They turn it into their domestic monetary money, and then they inflate and they have overinvestment, overcapacity, and they have to have corrections, which they're going through right now. But they never look at the big picture of maybe this is a just cause to look at Federal Reserve policy as much as anything. And of course, you can't ignore, if you want free and healthy and prosperous trade, you also you know, have to look at the taxation and the regulation. Right, more this is just regulating and saying, well, we know what's best for you to buy. So there are so many harms done, and there's no evidence throughout history that protectionism makes a wealthier economy. And of course, the theme of our program today is it's more likely to bring on war conditions, and I guess you're well aware of that, on the conditions, what happens on that. I think while we talk about that, maybe we can put up that graphic that we have to show what's happening in this trade war.
Yeah, it burns bridges. But if I understand what you said, there's kind of a vicious cycle that starts with the Fed and the monetary policy, and that money goes into the Chinese economy and creates a bubble. Plus, with China's sort of semi-command economy, they don't really know the prices of things because they're not subject to true consumer demand. So they start overproducing in certain areas, and then that comes back and sends goods to the U.S., and it just continues and continues.
Yeah, it's the retaliation. But you know, part of the reason the trade war started is that both economies probably are weakening, and that's what's happening. China's weaker and we're weaker, but they're not looking at the business cycle, the Austrian explanation of the business cycle. And as long as you ignore that, you're going to come up with patchwork and give people more and more power. And that is what's happening, but eventually it becomes very hostile. I mean, when you hear the comments in the campaign, it's not like, well, you know, I really like Chinese and I wish we could work this out, you know, a little bit better, but it's really pretty hostile, like they are to blame. But Trump had an interesting statement actually today because a company, I'm sure it's not a perfect company, but we have praised it because it produced a good product over the years, and that's Apple. And Apple gets voted a lot of money because the consumer likes their product. But Trump is out there bashing them. A small portion of their computer industry, of the whole company, they have manufacturing overseas. So he's attacking this fact that he says, we will stop that. We will not allow Apple to produce computers overseas. We're going to bring all those jobs back home, as if he knew that was the best thing. And the one question I'd like to see some of the interviewers ask on television is, well, Mr. Trump, you invest overseas, you take capital out of this country and you send it over there and you build golf courses and hotels. You're draining all this wealth from our country. You should be building some golf courses for the middle class in this country. Why don't you help the people if you're so anxious to bring jobs back? You bring your hotels back here and take a little less profit. That would be a silly argument, but it would be a consistent argument because, he's saying that I'm going to stop Apple from doing anything overseas.
Well, he'd probably say it's my money and I'll invest it where I want.
We would say, right on. But in history, there's a famous period in our history, actually Western civilization history, even though the trade wars and tariffs have been going on for a long time, they've been misled. But because all mercantilism was that they believed they could be self-sustaining. And the mercantilist idea is always there. And when people come along, governments and Federal Reserves mess up an economy, then it elicits this protectionist idea, and they want to regulate things. But in the 1800s, in the mid part of that century, the mercantilists were challenged by those who did not like the so-called corn laws, and that is where they taxed highly corn and other products, and food prices, can you believe, was sky high. But the farmers wanted the protection. The people finally figured it out, but they didn't do it on their own. There was a concerted educational effort by Richard Cobden and also by John Bright, who was in the Parliament. And they went around. It sort of reminded me about how we work to educate people on the Federal Reserve. But they eventually went and got the law changed and made a difference. Some people say that particular incident of the repeal of the corn laws was so important in introducing the age of industrialization, the Industrial Revolution, and it was to cut this. And they got a lot of grief over it, but they finally prevailed. They argued it on the moral viewpoint, but they also, looking at our title there about war, they were also very much pro-peace. They saw that at the time. So although they argued the economic case, they also recognized that if countries trade with each other, they're less likely to fight with each other.
It's interesting talking about war. I was looking on Zero Hedge today, and they talk about, we've talked about China, we talked about the collapse of commodity prices, and apparently China is flooding the U.S. with cheap steel, and that's a huge problem, apparently, according to the U.S. government. This Department of Commerce has put a tariff on corrosion-resistant steel from China now at 256%. This is something very new, and they say this will stop all of this overproduction of steel coming in the U.S. And Zero Hedge ended the article by saying, thus the U.S. fired the first shot in the trade war. It's going to be up to China to retaliate.
But then again, now that we live in the age of internationalism, instead of correcting the economic errors of both countries, they're going to say, aha, even these regulations are messy. The WTO, world government, they'll be able to sort this out. The WTO frequently is used to allow tariffs to be put on. It's not for free trade, it's for managed trade. And that's why libertarians have split on this. Some libertarians say, well, it'll lower tariffs. Others, like myself, would say, yes, but it's managed trade and they're going to Mickey Mouse around it and they're going to serve the special interest. Mm-hmm. So I think that that is what they're going to have to face up to. They're going to have to be able to explain this to people to understand why it's a benefit to have free free trade. But one thing that I remember very clearly, of course, and I've mentioned it before, is my experience in high school when we were fighting the Chinese in the Korean War. And that was terrible. I remember it so clearly because my high school coach was drafted and didn't come back. But we're not worrying about that right now. You know, Richard Nixon isn't going to be the most famous and most popular president, but he did. He actually talked to people that we were confronting, just like Kennedy talked to Khrushchev. And just think of all the grief this president, with all his faults, as soon as he talks to somebody, you know, the warmonger neocons, I mean, if they come down hard on him over Cuba and Iran, and yet this is really what we need, because we're less likely to go to a hot war unless this attitude of protectionism comes in and think that they can solve this problem, because they're not looking at the real cause of poverty and why the middle class is shrinking, and they want to blame somebody else.
Yeah.
I want to thank everybody for tuning in today, and I hope this issue of protectionism versus free trade is of interest to you, because to me it's very, very important. It's very historic, and the two people I mentioned, Cobden and Bright, at the time, mid part of the 18th century or the 19th century, got the Corn Laws repealed and made a big difference. But right now we're in need of that type of attitude, for people to stand on principle of free trade and sound money and understand why we're entering this contest and we're fighting with people over trade, and why they call it dumping. Well, they're dumping, maybe it's over capacity. Maybe our inflation here was exported to China, and then they built over capacity, and they built too much steel, and they weren't able to judge the market. So there's way too much overcapacity, and there's too much debt. It's a consequence of a deeply flawed monetary policy. And the world monetary policy, up until now at least, is run by our Federal Reserve System. But it's being challenged because the situation is getting tough. But what we don't need is another incentive for the neocons to use to go and have a hot war going on. And if we don't understand the trade issue, we're liable to move in that direction. And hopefully we can help prevent that. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in today, and please come back to the Liberty Report soon.